Technology and addressing privacy has been something that's been around for a very long time, but really we haven't started addressing it in meaningful ways until the last few decades. There are 4 types of privacy, too, that you need to think about. The first is informational privacy, and that's what most people think of when they think of privacy. It's protecting your credit card information, your social security number, and other types of specific data items. And certainly, that's something that you need to do, to protect that data and make sure it's not used inappropriately or shared inappropriately. But these other 3 areas are very important to address privacy issues within as well. And also, from a medical device perspective, just think about the impacts to privacy of these other 3 categories. The next one is bodily privacy. So bodily privacy has to do with anything that reveals something about a person's self. So it could be genetic testing. Those of you who flew here for the conference, when you went through the airport, what did you do? You went through the TSA scanning, bodily privacy. And certainly when you're talking about implantable medical devices and collecting data about the vitals of the person or the activities of the person, that has to do with bodily privacy as well. So as you're thinking about addressing privacy, go beyond informational and consider these bodily privacy issues too. There's also territorial privacy, so that's talking about surveillance. Drones is a very good example of how territorial privacy issues are arising because of the ways in which folks can actually see what you're doing, where you're at any point in time, where they're tracking your path throughout the day or the week. And then you have communications privacy. So that's the privacy of your emails, of your phone calls. We mentioned the NSA earlier, so certainly a lot of what they were doing and has concerns about has to do with communications privacy. It's very important to think about, too, privacy depends upon the context within which the data is being used and collected. A lot of people say, well, there's a lot of this information that I'm showing here that people freely put out on the internet, right, on social media sites. So why do we need to actually worry about protecting that data anymore, since obviously they put it out there so they don't care? Well, think about the context within which they put data on their Facebook page. Did they put it out there so marketers could come along and scrape it off and send them advertisements and marketing deals? Usually not. Did they put it out there so that others could take that data and do big data analysis and try to reveal things about their life that maybe then is used by their employers, by insurance companies, by the government, by those who want to levy taxes upon your different types of activities? Probably not. So you need to think about context. That's so important, and that's something that oftentimes people don't consider. You have to consider context when you're thinking about whether or not something is a privacy infringement. So this is kind of a laundry list for you to consider, and certainly as you're looking at your medical devices and the associated data that you add to it, do you have any of these data items? We're talking about informational privacy now, but it's coming from bodily privacy types of issues. So you need to think about that. And then also, under the HIPAA regulation, it defines privacy and protected health information as basically any type of information that can point to a specific individual. So you cannot just depend upon that list of personal information items alone. You have to think beyond that to whatever types of images, data analysis results, and so on might reveal something about a specific individual. That type of data may be considered to be protected health information based upon the context within which you're using it. So that's a very important thing to think about. And also, under HIPAA, it's any form I know we've been talking a lot about digital data, but there's been a lot of breaches from print data. I mean, the very first penalty over $1 million under HIPAA was for a pharmacy that was throwing prescription bottles out in their dumpsters behind their buildings, and it had their full prescription labels still on them. Very low tech and a very big privacy breach. So you need to think about the full life cycle of data and information at the point in time it's collected or created to the point in time that you're disposing of it. HIPAA and medical devices then. So who's covered by HIPAA? This is a source of a lot of confusion to many. HIPAA applies to health plans, insurance companies. It applies to healthcare providers, your hospitals, your clinics, your doctors, nurses, anyone that's associated with caregiving, and then your healthcare clearinghouses. So those are the types of companies that take data from one type of entity and they change the format of that data and pass it on to another. So oftentimes a company will take data, insurance claims from doctors' offices, change the format, pass it on to the insurance company to be paid out. They're a clearinghouse. Now, business associates, and this is very important too because many medical device folks are business associates. A business associate is basically any individual or organization that is performing an activity to support covered entities' activities. And it's involving access to that protected health information, or they might be storing it. This is where a lot of cloud services come in as being business associates, or disclosure of the PHI. Under the omnibus rule that was finalized early last year and went into effect in September of last year, business associates now effectively have to comply with all of the HIPAA and high-tech requirements that are applicable to the types of services they provide. It's no longer just a business associate agreement type of compliance issue. So if you're a medical device company and you're a business associate, you have to comply with all of the HIPAA requirements, and then you also have to think about any subcontractors that you're allowing access to that protected health information. I thought I'd put this in here, it's kind of fun. This is the first non-invasive pacemaker, and I kind of want to show how we start out with medical devices. I actually had the great opportunity to speak with Dr. Frank Tyers. He was the person who created the patent along with his colleagues clear back in 1966. Now I know a lot of times when I'm speaking with medical device folks, they reference the FDA recommendations, and certainly you need to know about the FDA recommendations, but keep in mind the FDA is about patient safety and well-being, right? They're just getting into the security issues of medical devices and the fact that there's data that's being collected and has to be protected. So this is a very abbreviated list of those FDA recommendations. But keep in mind that the FDA does not replace your other obligations to secure your data based upon risk within your organization. In fact, there's been many times when the FDA has explicitly said, you know, that's not their primary focus. They're providing the recommendations because medical device manufacturers are asking for it. But I've also had them say at various conferences and seminars that they expect that the Department of Health and Human Services is going to be the regulatory power that looks at how the data is protected that these devices collect. So you can't assume that you only have to now think about FDA requirements. And I know from listening to all the sessions yesterday that you have a lot there that you have to deal with. But you also now, since you have this new technology creating and collecting all this new data, you have to protect that data also. It's also, there's some reports out there that you might find very interesting too that has to do with the security and privacy of the data as well. Health Management Technology magazine did a recent study and they found at a very high level that the most vulnerable devices are represented by these 5 categories. Certainly, if you do a risk assessment and you did not include medical devices, then basically that data on those medical devices is not being addressed appropriately. Something that's important to understand about information security and having good effective controls is that you must base it upon the risk that is present within your environment. And the risk within one type of medical provider is going to be very different oftentimes than the risk within another type. For instance, a large hospital system is going to have different types of risks, security risks, that have to be mitigated than a small clinic that might be out in a rural area. So you need to implement security controls based upon risk assessment and mitigating them appropriately. Then, of course, you have malware. And there's been several studies to show that medical devices running on various versions of Windows are susceptible to malware. And different types of malware can do very bad things to these different systems, including going so far as to actually make them unusable through some sort of worm malware or a distributed denial of service attack and so on. Also, a risk was when you didn't have information about all of those devices that were coordinated throughout the departments. So if some departments don't know about a device, they might be actually putting that data that was collected from that device at risk simply because they didn't realize where the data came from, who's using it, how it's being shared, and so on. Definitely, if you have no access control or authentication into the device, that was a big risk. And those who are, and this is becoming more and more common, and I think we're going to see more of it as time goes on too, communicating with social media sites through different apps to send data from the medical devices to them. There's some significant concerns there. Deloitte did a report back in 2013 that I think you'll find interesting, and I'm not going to go through every point here, but what I'm trying to emphasize by showing you all the results of all these different research studies is that there are a lot of security issues that you need to address, but if you start looking at and analyzing these security issues, you'll see that there's some real commonalities between them. And then late last year, there was a DeepSec 2013 session. This is actually one that's out on YouTube. It lasts around an hour, just short of an hour, but it was very interesting. And this was a quote from within it. 300 different medical devices from 40 different vendors had hard-coded passwords set within them. This is a huge security concern if you're using hard-coded passwords, and this is something that's been recognized within the information security practice since many decades ago. That's a very simple no-no, not to have them.
Over the past 3 years, I've had some time to do some research, and I've been at Iowa State University doing my research. And I focused not on pacemakers, this was part of my research, but the major part of my research was how manufacturers, how hospitals, and how all the stakeholders in this industry can work together to create more secure devices. And I used pacemakers as kind of my case study. And instead of going through a bunch of lists and going real fast and trying to squeeze 3 years of research into 15 minutes, I've just decided to kind of give you the basics findings on pacemakers and what can we do to kind of mitigate some of these steps, and then what are the tools out there that are being sold to the general public that are creating havoc. So to get started off, the pacemaker the vulnerability is being blown up by the media. They're using a lot of words out there to incite reactions. It could kill you, it might. All these words out there are driving the fear up. There's, to my knowledge, not ever been an attack on a pacemaker that hasn't been done in an environment or in a research setting. So to have an actual hack on a pacemaker in the hospital settings or out in the environment hasn't happened. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but it hasn't happened to this point. But the fear keeps on rising because these articles keep on coming out saying we can kill people. Movies and TVs find this provocative, so they make whole shows about it, and they're driving the fear, which adds to security issues. So when I'm thinking about this problem, you got to kind of think to yourself, where is your information around in your hospital? And this is a real quick slide, and just to kind of think to yourself, it's everywhere, and there is information on your pacemaker. So when I set out to do this research, I want to make it clear that my goal here is to help out manufacturers to find vulnerabilities in pacemaker, but also to help mitigate that, to give solutions, not to point a finger at any one manufacturer and say, this manufacturer is not doing a good job, or to debunk the myths that are out there. Because there's a lot of myths and a lot of fear being driven that isn't necessarily true. Okay, so what I did is I got some pacemakers. It's a really big security issue here in my mind. This is kind of a physical security issue. With the ease that I had getting pacemakers, I should have been able to just walk out and find pacemakers. I got 4 of them. It took me 2 weeks, about three or four phone calls, got to the right people, and they sent me pacemakers in the mail. You cannot sell pacemakers on eBay. They consider it like a drug, a prescribable medical device. I tried putting one up there and immediately got rejected, which is good for eBay. But that's something that I feel in the industry we need to tighten up a little bit more is what devices can be sold on eBay. Because I also purchased a programmer machine from a hospital or somebody who was selling it in California, and it came to me loaded down with about 500 client data on it. So, and not only did it come to me with the client data on it, it came to me with the rep's name, the rep's serial number, his, so I could call the manufacturer and say, I'm rep 293165. I need an update on this device. And they were proud to update it. That's a little social engineering. So they need to really work on how much of this information is out in the market to just be bought. Because if I can buy the programmer, then I've essentially bought all the secrets. I can dig into that programmer and find, how does this thing connect? What do I need to do to make a mobile version of this thing? You can't go by the idea that this device is only going to be used for good. I bought this device to use for good, but somebody else could have bought it to take it and use the secrets to sell or use the secrets to design their own little system. Okay, so what information is on pacemakers? This is just a quick slide. There is some HIPAA data on pacemakers. It kind of varies by pacemaker. There are fields that can be filled in by doctors, so any information can be on there. There's also histories. I was able to pull a history of a person. I deleted all that information, by the way, for about 1.5 years of his heart and what it was doing. That's very important information. If you were to get that of like a politician, that possibly could be an election-changing type of information. Okay, so the reason I have this slide up here is to kind of tell you how they connect, to kind of start debunking a little bit of some of the myths that are out there. You need a programming unit from the manufacturer. Some manufacturers use different frequencies, use different codes. Not all programming units use the same thing. They all don't interoperate with each other. You need a programming head with a magnet because the magnet activates the pacemaker. They communicate anywhere in the 175 kilohertz range and different ranges too. They all change depending on what's going on. The pictures you see up there is basically your communication signal on the top here. And it's telling I'm connecting. The oscilloscope we were using could decode that. So there wasn't a lot of encryption or anything being used on a pacemaker. Obviously, they're small devices. They need to utilize their battery. And it's hard to put a real sophisticated encryption on something like that. The other pictures of the magnet. But you only have 1 minute to connect to this device. So already there you can kind of see that some of these myths that are out there are already starting to fall apart. Because after 1 minute, you have to reactivate it again with a magnet. And it's pretty hard to hack somebody from a distance when you have to come up and slap a magnet on their chest. So, and the signal, when I was working with the machines, when you got about a foot away from the body, it was extremely weak, almost to the point where you couldn't connect. You had to have your antenna very close. So what do you need to hack a pacemaker right now? To the researchers, and this has been done a few times, and I was able to replicate some of this in my research. You need a software-defined radio, which is off to the left there. You need one of these guys, which I got a picture, which I got one right here. You know, you need an oscilloscope, a programming machine, probably some pacemakers, and then a C programmer guy to learn how to write the code, how to intercept it, how to decode it, what do I do with it then? You know, if I do all that, do I just get a bunch of information about a person, and what am I going to do with that? You know, if I know a person's heartbeat. You know, stealing the information off a device is a lot easier than stealing the information and then reconfiguring it in a way that the device will accept it and reprogram it. My conclusions from my research. Right now, hacking a pacemaker is difficult. An example would be, with all that information, I probably, if Rebecca had a pacemaker, could intercept it from here. But I could not intercept it from the other side of the room. And if you were a politician and you're up, you know, on stage here, it might look really funny if she had a big antenna pointed at you. Secret Service might not like that. You know, and that's not saying that somebody with a satellite-sized antenna couldn't hack you from another room or something like that. That could happen. But you're going to leave tracks. This idea that somebody can not leave any tracks around when they're going to do this type of hacking is kind of false, because you're going to leave research tracks, you're going to leave purchasing tracks, you're going to leave all these tracks of all these other things that are going on. That hey, Amazon knows how many times you buy underwear a year, and if you buy some of this equipment online, they're going to know you're buying it. That being said, somebody like Dick Cheney needs to take this into consideration, because we've driven the fear so high with the articles and the TV events that just the idea and the blackmailing of the fact that I can do it would be reason for somebody like Dick Cheney to have a different system in there. Like I said before, pacemakers cannot be hacked from a distance. RF signals are weak, but that doesn't mean to say that new technology or a new system couldn't come out and it could be done easily. Knowing this, I wouldn't have any problem having a pacemaker in myself. That being said, my next slide and my last slide is kind of the one I want to spend a little time on. These are the tools that are out there on the market right now that are causing problems. I have most of them here with me. Off to the far left is a tool that is being released next month. It's called a HackRF. This will allow you to send and receive most RF signals and code them any way you want. So it's a kind of an open platform, design what you want system that kind of changes the game, because if a coder or somebody decides to put out a way to hack pacemakers on a torrent site or on social media, then all of a sudden anybody with a HackRF will have the tool to basically do it. The center one is the rubber ducky. I have it right here. They all have real nice names. I love these names. This little rubber ducky right here is a social engineering tool. Now this doesn't apply to medical devices, I mean to pacemakers, but there's a little card in here and you can make this look like a USB. And if anybody puts that into their computer, it acts as a keyboard and will bypass all security and do what you want, like delete Windows system, send me your user information. And they have all kinds of codes pre-made that you can already download, and it's all out there. All kinds of little nasty codes. These things work in any medical device that runs any type of Windows system, any type of Linux system, and has a USB drive. This little guy here I have on there too is called a pineapple. This is specifically designed, these are all purchasable by anybody, to steal and watch in plain text what you're doing on your computer. It will assume the ID of the internet that you're on, and you won't know it. You'll think you're hooked to Hilton Honors. And then you can sit back and watch what everybody's doing. So these devices are out there. And then you have the Ubertooth, which is designed to specifically inject Bluetooth networks and to mess with Bluetooth networks. Basically all Bluetooth networks. But what we like to do is you can say you got your Raspberry Pi hooked to your Ubertooth, hooked to your Pineapple, and it sounds really nice and fun.
There's been a lot of research done with how vulnerable networks and systems are because of the actions of humans and their curiosity. There have been many different research projects going on. I know a friend of mine up in Canada did what he's called the Honey Stick Project, and basically he would drop USB drives at various hotels throughout different cities, and he would actually then, with code that was on that USB drive, be able to tell how many people just stuck it right in there, where they were at, get their IP address and other data from their computer. And of course, that comes down to awareness. You need to make sure that you train your folks at your organization. Don't be sticking stuff that you don't know into your computer. If you find something, it could have some malware on there and it could have been planted. So it kind of reminds me of the ducky. People find those little things and they're going to say, I wonder what this has on it. Stick it in there and you've been compromised, basically. So now, what are you going to do then about addressing today's devices? Well, Dr. Tyers is still working on creating the new advanced type of pacemakers, and some of you might be familiar with his work, but in speaking with him a week or two ago, I know he was talking about some conferences that he was getting ready to go to and so on, and he expressed a concern about how the storage capabilities are increasing dramatically as capabilities on the pacemakers are too. So, Shelby was talking about the existing pacemakers today in his research, but we have to think, be forward thinking and looking at the new types of technologies and the new expanded capabilities they have. And as he expressed concern for the fact that you could actually store an entire medical history onto a pacemaker. When you go from RF transmission to Bluetooth as well, you're going to dramatically expand the distance from which others will be able to get access to those transmissions potentially. Now, this was something, I just saw this last week, and it was very, very intriguing to me how you could take an MRI or a CT scan and use a 3D printer of a heart and use a 3D printer to create a model of that heart. And then from that, you can create this mesh that's a sensor that you can actually implant on that heart, and you can use it to constantly monitor the heartbeat and the heart health. That's cool, right? If somebody needs a little jolt to get their heart going again, you're going to be able to do that. But what scared me was they were talking also about this, and some of you might be very familiar with this, but they were also talking about how they would have an app available for you to be able to administer or investigate the activities of this mesh implant from an app on your smartphone. And through my research with apps, there's anywhere from 90 to 95% of apps which really are new, and of course regulations are very reactionary, so there's no meaningful rules or laws about the type of security you need to have in the apps that exist right now. California has some, and some other states are getting some. Actually, California is not a specific law. They have suggestions or guidelines for you to follow. But can you imagine if people start using apps to actually communicate with and control these different types of devices and potentially change the controls and get data from them? So those two things point out to me that it's so vital to build in your security controls to these devices, to the apps that you're going to use with them, and also then to protect the data that's collected from them or stored within them. So what are some risks that I've seen? I've done probably over 250 different information security and privacy risk assessments throughout healthcare business associates and also covered entities. And
These are some of the primary risks that I've seen with regard to the medical devices. So I've seen that there's been a lot of unauthorized access that is capable to the devices, to the controls, the ability to change the controls of those devices, either within the device itself or, as Shelby pointed out, through the programmer that controlled how that device worked. Also, unauthorized access to the data, be it either on the devices itself or within the various repositories where that data was collected and oftentimes stored in multiple locations throughout the network, wide area network, and then shared with business associates who oftentimes didn't even realize that they had to actually protect that data when they were actually using it. Malware is a huge thing, and there's new types of malware being created all the time, and it's hard to keep up. You've heard of perhaps zero-day types of attacks or malware. Well, those are the things that pop up and there hasn't been any protection against them yet because somebody thought of a new way to attack a system or get access to data. No access logs. This is something else too. That's a risk because how are you going to be able to analyze and determine how data was exploited or how a system was exploited unless you're able to do some sort of forensics to trace back the activities that led to the exploit to begin with. So access logs and the ability to know who's gotten to a device, who's made changes, at what time, date, and so on is very important. It also supports various types of regulatory requirements because under HIPAA, there's the accounting of disclosures requirement, which says that for a lot of activities, you need to be able to determine the individual who got access to PHI, so you need to consider that as well. You need to also, or I've seen in the risks that resulted from all these audits, no one was logging when changes were made to the settings, controls, and then keeping track of, well, was there associated patient harm that resulted from these lack of security controls or exploitation of security vulnerabilities. And then, of course, a lot of regulatory noncompliance. Last month, you probably heard of the Heartbleed vulnerability. And a lot of medical devices are susceptible to this. And a lot of, I think, medical device folks may not realize it, but basically in a nutshell, make it very high level, the Heartbleed vulnerability was a silly, elementary, Security 101 type of error in programming. And it was made in an open source code, OpenSSL. And if you don't know what OpenSSL is, think about when you're on the internet and you want to know if your browser or your connection is encrypted, you look to see HTTPS, or you see a little lock on your screen. Well, if you see those, chances are you're using some version of OpenSSL to do that encryption along with other things that is going on that you aren't aware of. Well, this heartbeat vulnerability, or Heartbleed, I'm sorry, vulnerability occurred in what's called the Heartbeat code section of OpenSSL version 1.0.1 to 1.0.1F. And basically the programmer made a mistake in how it communicated to maintain the connection with the different sites or devices that it was communicating with, so that when it would ask for a response, a hacker or someone malicious could ask for basically all the data they could get that's surrounding that portion of memory. And a lot of times the data in memory had some very sensitive information with it. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, I did a TV spot that you can find on YouTube to try to explain it at a very high level. But something I would say for all of you to check on is, do you have medical devices that are running OpenSSL 1.0.1 to 1.0.1F? If you are, then you have the vulnerable version of this open source code, and you need to make sure you think about how you're going to address that and get a version that's not vulnerable out there. The HIPAA non-compliance penalties expanded greatly with the final omnibus rule that came out last year. And you know, watching and listening to all of your sessions yesterday and also in conversations with many of you, I realized that HIPAA is confusing for probably one of the primary reasons is because as opposed to FDA, which I noticed lots of checklists there, you know, FDA for your devices, getting certified and so on, you have checklists. HIPAA is not a checklist type of thing. HIPAA is something that establishes 3 different areas under the security rule, and then you have the privacy rule, and then you have high tech. But they're talking about different topics that you have to address appropriately based upon risk within your organization, and that's why it cannot be a checklist thing, because risk within each organization is different. So you need to do a risk assessment, which a lot of organizations don't do. They think they can just do this HIPAA compliance as a checklist. But you need to determine what your risks are and then apply the appropriate controls as found in all these different topics under HIPAA high tech, HIPAA and high tech as appropriate to your organization. This is just to give you an idea of the levels of fines and penalties. And I want to point out too, this is per violation. So if you have a violation, let's say with passwords, that would be 1 violation. And if you also have a violation with not providing training or awareness, that would be a 2nd violation. And if you had another one with, let's say, shared user IDs, that would be another one. And the list could go on and on. A lot of organizations have gotten huge penalties as a result of what's called willful neglect. Basically, willful neglect means that they chose not to implement the compliance requirements of HIPAA. HIPAA's been out there in effect since 2003, the privacy rule. So if you know that you have HIPAA out there, but you don't have documented policies and procedures, you don't have someone with assigned responsibility and so on, and they come and do an audit, or there's a breach, or somebody complains, or your state attorney general, and every one of the state attorney generals now have the ability to enforce HIPAA as well. You could have drastically high penalties. And in fact, I don't know if you can see that too well, the penalties are increasing and the number of audits are increasing. The Department of Health and Human Services said that they are going to start doing business associate audits in addition to covered entity audits, and that they're planning to do in the next round, I've heard anywhere from 300 to 500, so it depends on the person in the Department of Health and Human Services you're talking to. But just last week, a hospital and also the teaching university associated with it was given a $4.8 million fine for HIPAA non-compliance, and that resulted from a breach investigation. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to make sure that you have someone who's been assigned responsibility for security and privacy. You need to make sure you have documented policies and procedures, security policies and procedures, and that you follow them. If you have documented policies and procedures and you aren't following them, that's going to make your penalty go up in the scale. You also need to have regular training and awareness. Build in your security controls, and that's what I'm so happy to hear when I've been speaking to a lot of you from medical device organizations, the fact that you are planning to actually build in security controls and privacy controls, because you can't wait till you're finished with your product and try to slap on security or privacy as an afterthought. It's not going to be effective if you do it that way. Make sure that any apps that you're using with devices, any wearables that's collecting data that could be protected health information, that could modify device settings or system settings on your network, make sure that they have security and privacy controls built into them. Make sure you consistently enforce the policies. If you don't, you could get higher fines and penalties. And something that's not a requirement of HIPAA, but over the past couple of decades, I found it's very effective to ensuring that folks think about security and privacy in their job responsibilities on a daily basis. Make it a part of the annual job review. If they know that you're going to consider that as part of the annual job review, then they're going to try to know your security and privacy policies more. And I have a checklist out on my website that I made up if any of you want to download it. It goes beyond this. It's a little more detailed. So parting thoughts, yesterday I heard a lot about the importance to the patient and to the way your device is used for data integrity. Well, guess what? To have data integrity, you have to have security controls built in. Those security controls help to ensure data integrity, and if you don't have them, it's possible that that data could be changed in unauthorized and dangerous ways. Availability, security controls help you with that, and then confidentiality. Definitely security controls help you with that. Here's another thing. I heard a comment a couple of times in the past 2 days that, well, you can't have 100% security and privacy, so why do you need to even worry about it? Well, you're right. If you had 100% security and privacy in a computer system, your computer system would be shut down and wouldn't be networked to anything. Anytime you're dealing with computing systems or with information in any form, there's going to be risk. So what it's important for you to do is build in the controls so you can mitigate the risk to prevent as many as possible and have other controls to detect when bad things happen as soon as possible, so then you can address them appropriately. And then always think and remember that the controls are necessary to protect your patients, to protect your business, and then also to meet compliance. Because again, compliance and regulations are always reactionary, so they're always going to be way behind where technology advances are. And if they're behind technology advances, they're never going to be able to address all of the security and privacy controls within those new technologies. So you have to go beyond just thinking in a compliance-only mindset. You have to think of a risk management mindset that considers all of the new vulnerabilities and threats in new types of technologies. And here's our contact information, my business websites. I have a new book coming out, my second one on HIPAA, that I created the cover of that, so I thought I'd put it up there. I like to be a little bit of artsy every now and then. But anyway, that's coming out this fall. And any questions?
Rebecca, I'm really glad that you're here and you gave the presentation. I've seen you speak before. I knew what to expect. Shelby, you will be escorted from the building, and I would like to confiscate your ducky.
Oh, okay.
So all of you, since he's not laser distance away, you should be safe, and he will be dealt with appropriately. You have a question? I have a question too, and I got the mic, so I'm going first. We've had this conversation offline. Rebecca is a member of the advisory board, as I've shared, and I invite all of you, but I especially invite the advisory board, people that I've handpicked to be experts in their field, to seed conversation in the group because they have something to share. And she's been very generous with her time, and she's done it a couple times, and I don't remember all of the subjects at the moment, but one of them was about heart bleed, and one of them was about, are you taking these precautions? And I'm greatly overgeneralizing here. This is a worldwide group, selectively who decides to leave a comment, etc. But something that came up more than once was, you're an alarmist, you're a consultant, you're trying to generate fear and fees for yourself. You are the problem. And yes. I'm like, what's going on here? It's almost as though there's some kind of denial that this is real. I mean, our devices aren't going to get hacked, and I don't need all of this stuff. What do you reply to that?
Oh, I love that question because I've been dealing with this since I started building. I built the security and information privacy program at a large multinational financial and health insurance organization starting in 1991, and I built it throughout the 1990s and left there in 2000. So, I'm trying to share what I've seen as a practitioner throughout those years and the challenges, and just think about how hard it was in the 90s for me. We had no regulations, but I saw that there was risk, and I just was concerned because I genuinely want to make sure that the business is protected as well as the customers and clients we have, to make sure their data is not inappropriately used or breached. So that's something that I've dealt with a lot, and I think once people start thinking about and truly understand the complexity of everything involved with securing information and how you have to look at risk. It's not a checklist, it's a logical thinking process. I think then they start seeing that. But also, I've been an adjunct professor at Norwich University, Master of Science in Information Security and Assurance, since 2005. So I also just love to teach and help people understand these things, because I believe the more people understand, not only those of you building devices, but the general public, I try to make them aware of security and privacy issues. As I see technology advancing and evolving, it's only going to become more critical to know how to secure information and protect your own personal privacy through the actions that you personally take and the challenges that you make to those entities that you're doing business with. So I do hear those sometimes, and it's kind of frustrating to me because I feel that I'm giving good information. I'm trying not to sell it when I'm doing it, but of course I have my own business, so my business is associated with my name.
One of the things that stuck with me and when we were talking was a reply you get is, well, if it were that important, FDA would have required it.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Well, I've heard that a lot too. And the FDA, as I mentioned earlier, they are concerned with patient health and safety, but that's not been their wheelhouse since they've been doing medical device safety issues. And I think that's why they're looking to the Department of Health and Human Services right now. But just one more quick point to make. I had a comment from a medical device person. I don't think they're in this crowd, but a direct message to me. They said, well, we're spending $1.2 million on our marketing campaign, but we aren't supposed to spend more than $10,000 on our security program. And how can we address that? So I gave some tips directly to them, but it's hard when you don't see security or privacy controls as a return on investment. You see it's just something you have to do. But it truly is a differentiator for your business if you can say you care about the data and you're protecting it.
Thank you for your presentation, both of you. It was very eye-opening. I have a question way into the future. Nicholas Negroponte predicted that we'll be ingesting information in the next 30 years. And can you speak to what that would have for, what implications that would have on privacy? Ingesting. We would take a pill and we would know how to speak English.
Oh, yeah. A lot of that is interesting. In fact, yesterday I made the comment to some of you, I love that last session because my son has all of Philip K. Dick's novels and stories, and I was watching that. It's like, holy cow, this is all, these projections coming to life. With regard to that, definitely if we get to that point, and I'm not sure, did you say 30 years? I think there's challenges to that timing, but certainly we're going to have some sort of controls like we already need to address the privacy issues with regard to new technologies and how they do present not only privacy issues, but as I was discussing with some of you this morning, there's also associated ethical issues. Just because you can have data that reveals information about a person's life and it might be valuable to someone, what are the ethical issues in actually doing something with that data or taking action upon it? You'll see privacy and ethics very closely related in a lot of organizations, and in fact, in a lot of financial companies, they have the ethics officer actually also addressing privacy. So, I don't know what the possibility of that is, but certainly it's something to address. Last month, I was at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I've been doing work for them since 2009, but I was at a privacy engineering workshop in Gaithersburg, and we were talking about, as case studies, the privacy implications of drones. And I love this discussion because there's no meaningful laws out there to address the privacy issues. So it's kind of like that. We need to think about it now, so when the time comes, we can say, well, wait, before we actually allow this to happen, let's make sure that we control who gets the data, how they use it, who they share it with, and so on, because those are all very important privacy aspects.
We plan to include bioethics in next year's presentation, so I hope you can join us. Our next question from Alan.
Hello, great presentation. How should we address wireless data when SSL is totally broken? And I mean, an SSL sniff can do a man-in-the-middle attack and breach any data, even if we do, best.
Well, and that's a great question. I've heard that several times throughout the last several months, especially after NSA did that type of go around to be able to get to data that would have been encrypted with SSL. SSL isn't necessarily broken, it's vulnerable depending upon who's using different tactics. Also keep in mind, SSL is only encrypting the pipe as the data is being transferred. So you still have to use encryption when it's in storage. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. When you use SSL, you're not encrypting data where it's being stored. You have to use a different type of encryption device for that. Now, if you are afraid of transmitting and depending upon SSL, I advise there's always other types of encryption you can use on top of that to encrypt data as you send it through any type of public network. In fact, there's a lot of really good types of vendors that have encryption that are not giving this type of vulnerability to certain agents, and certainly not to the criminals, because keep in mind, just because you might have one group that may have a workaround for data, you still have a whole world full of other people out there with malicious intent that might be doing things with that data far beyond and more damaging than what the agency that was able to get around that SSL is doing.
One short, is there any kind of offensive measures you'd recommend, honeypots, tripwire type stuff? Or?
Well, it's definitely you need to do intrusion detection types of prevention, and also the honeypots. I'd be careful with that because you get into legal issues depending upon where you're implementing the honeypots and how you did it. So basically honeypot is you're trying to lure the crooks to your data so you can catch them when they get there. And then there's the kind that actually is a reverse attack. That's very risky from not only a liability standpoint, but also just from, you could do, when you do a reverse attack against someone who then bounces back an even nastier attack. Yes, exactly. So definitely there's a lot you can do. And in fact, I would encourage you to talk with Shelby afterwards, because he could tell you all about, I think, in many types of defensive activities there.
And I would advise you to speak with Shelby at a distance.
Especially if he has this.
Our last question's from Arundhati.
Thanks for the presentation. I actually have a question for Shelby. So 2 quick ones. One is, who funded your research? And 2, do you have any quick advice, maybe 3 things that device makers can do to make their pacemakers and other connected devices more secure? Thank you.
Yeah, am I on? Hello? Not on yet. I have to speak into this. Hello? Yeah, your first question was, sorry, that threw me off. What was your first question? I funded my research.
He's taking donations.
I'm taking donations. I'd like to get that hack RF. But advice would be, is that we're at a point where if we don't start building a foundation of standard security measures on medical devices in general, we're heading up this straight line. And if we don't start now, in 10 years or in 5 years, maybe 2 years, do you really want all these devices within your body or on your body with no security measures on them? And what that might mean to a place that wants to do harm to our medical industry, because it's an area of security for the United States. It's a safe area. And so medical device manufacturers need to get together in general and start, and hospitals, and start opening communications in that, okay, the programming machine didn't even have a login. That means I had full access to it from day one. A simple login. Just putting a login on there would have stopped me and had me spend months trying to figure out how to break the login. So there's just basic, simple things that can be done that could really help out.